Susanna Whitfield had read the same letter so many times the folds had gone soft as cloth, and yet she still could not say what kind of man had written it. The words were careful, warm, but never too warm. He asked about her favorite hymns and her mother's health, and once, only once, he had written that he hoped she would not be disappointed when she saw him for the first time. She had read that line 100 times on the train west, turning it over like a stone in her pocket, trying to guess what it meant. She was 26, past the age most folks back home considered marrying age, and she had made her peace with that a long time ago. What she had not made her peace with was arriving in a town called Miller's Bend, stepping off the train into a wind that smelled of dust and cattle, and being told by the station man that Samuel Hawthorne was dead. 3 weeks passed, the man said, not unkindly, wiping his hands on his apron. Fever took him quick. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "Didn't nobody wire you?" Nobody had. She stood on the platform with her trunk and her letters and the address of a ranch house she had never seen, and she did not know what a woman was supposed to do with herself when the man she'd crossed the country to marry had gone into the ground without so much as a telegram to stop her. It was Thomas Hawthorne who came for her in the end, because someone had to, and because his mother would not hear of leaving a stranger stranded at the depot regardless of the circumstances. He was younger than Samuel by 2 years, quieter, with the kind of face that gave nothing away unless you knew to look for it. He did not offer his condolences the way she expected. He did not offer much of anything, in fact, beyond a nod and a hand for her trunk. "You'll stay at the house tonight," he said. "My mother's expecting you. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you back east, if that's what you want. And if it isn't?" He looked at her then, properly, for the first time. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, not quite worry, and was gone before she could name it. "Then I suppose we'll have to figure something else out." The ride to the ranch was long and mostly silent. The kind of silence that made a person aware of every small sound. The creak of the wagon, the wind moving through the grass, her own breathing. Susanna watched the land roll past, wide and empty, in a way that made the letters in her lap feel even smaller than they were, and she found herself studying the man beside her instead. There was something familiar in the set of his jaw, in the way he held the reins loose and easy. She could not place it until they were nearly at the house, and then it struck her, all at once. It was the handwriting, the particular slant of his letters when he'd signed the receipt at the depot. She had seen that same careful, upright hand 100 times, folded soft in her pocket. She did not say anything, not yet. But the thought sat in her chest like a stone all through supper, through Mrs. Hawthorne's quiet grief and gentle questions, through the offer of a room upstairs that had, until 3 weeks ago, belonged to a man Susanna had never met, and now never would. It was near midnight when she found the truth of it, and she found it by accident, the way most truths get found. She had gone looking for a candle in the front room, and found instead a small writing desk, and on it a stack of letters in progress. Her own hand, she realized with a start, letters she had sent months ago, sitting open, and read and reread, with notes scrawled in the margins in that same upright hand, words underlined, questions written in the white space, as if someone had been working out how to answer her. Samuel's hand had been looser, she remembered now, comparing it in her mind to the receipt at the depot, rounder, careless in the way of a man who did not think too hard about how his words looked on paper. These were not Samuel's letters. She stood there a long while, with the candle burning low, working through what that meant, and what it meant that nobody had told her, and what kind of man sat up nights working out how to answer a woman he had never intended her to fall for. "You weren't meant to find those." She turned. Thomas stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, and for once his face was not so careful. He looked like a man caught at something, though she could not yet say what the something was, whether it was tenderness, or deception, or some tangled version of both. Samuel asked you to write them, she said slowly, testing the shape of it. Didn't he? At first, Thomas did not move from the doorway. He wasn't much for letters, never had the patience for it. He asked me to help him find the words, and then he asked me to just write them outright, and then he stopped. And then it got harder to stop. The candle guttered between them. Outside, the wind picked up against the house, and somewhere in the dark a horse shifted in its stall, and Susanna Whitfield stood in a stranger's front room, 3,000 miles from anything she knew, holding proof that the man she'd been writing to for a year had never really existed at all, and the man who had, the one whose words she had actually fallen for, was standing not 6 feet away, looking at her like he was waiting to find out whether she'd ask him to leave. She did not know, yet, what she meant to say to that. Susanna set the candle down before her hand could betray how badly it shook. Thomas did not move from the doorway, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching thin between two people who had, in a manner of speaking, already known each other a year. "You should have told me," she said finally. "Told you what? That my brother couldn't be bothered to court his own wife? There was no bitterness in it, only a tiredness that suggested he had turned this thought over many times before she'd ever arrived to complicate it further. He meant well enough. He just wasn't a man for words. Figured you'd never know the difference. And he wasn't wrong. Until tonight. That's not an answer to my question." Thomas exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man lets out when he has been holding something a long while and is tired of the weight of it. "No," he admitted, "it isn't." She studied him, really studied him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to, on the ride out, when it had felt safer to look at the fences and the grass and anything that wasn't a strange man's face. He had Samuel's coloring, she supposed, the same dark hair, but none of the easy confidence the station man had described when he'd spoken of Samuel with such fondness. Thomas held himself like someone bracing for a verdict. "I ought to be angry," she said. "You've every right to be." "I'm not certain I am, though. That's the trouble of it." She picked up one of the letters from the desk, her own hand looking back at her, and beside it, his notes in the margin. Careful, considering, like a man weighing every word before he trusted it to paper. "You asked once if I'd be disappointed when I saw him." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I remember. Were you asking for him or for yourself?" He didn't answer right away, and the not answering told her more than any words could have. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked. His mother, perhaps, unable to sleep any better than they were, and the moment broke apart before either of them could finish it. "It's late," Thomas said. "You should rest. We'll talk in the morning, if you're still wanting to." He left her standing there with the letters and the candle, and a great deal more uncertainty than she'd carried off the train. Morning came gray and cool, the kind of light that made the ranch look smaller and more honest than it had the night before. Susanna found Mrs. Hawthorne in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, working dough with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that grief didn't excuse a person from breakfast. "You'll forgive me for not asking last night," the older woman said without turning, "but I expect you have questions." "A few." "He didn't tell you about the letters." It wasn't a question, and Susanna didn't treat it as one. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Hawthorne set down the dough and wiped her hands, and when she finally looked at Susanna, there was something careful in her expression. Not quite an apology, but close to it. "Samuel was my son, and I loved him, and I won't speak ill of him now that he's gone, but he was a man who wanted the comforts of a wife, without much interest in the work of becoming a husband. Thomas did the work. He just never got credit for it, on account of it never being his to claim." "Why not?" "Because Samuel was the elder, and because that's how things were settled between them, a long time before you ever came into it, and because She stopped herself, and something in her face suggested there was more to that sentence than she meant to finish. It's not my place to say the rest. That's Thomas's to tell, if he's of a mind to. Susanna turned that over while she ate, and turned it over again while she helped clear the dishes, and by mid-morning, when she found herself walking the fence line with no particular destination in mind, she was still turning it over, because it seemed to her that a woman ought to understand a thing fully before she decided how to feel about it. She found Thomas out past the north pasture, mending a break in the fence with the kind of focused, unhurried patience that seemed to characterize everything about him. He didn't look up right away when she approached, though she suspected he'd heard her coming. "Your mother says there's more to why Samuel got the letters and not you," she said, deciding there was no sense easing into it. "Says it's not settled between you the way it ought to be." Thomas's hands stilled on the wire. "My mother talks more than she should." "Is she wrong?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and then he set down the pliers and looked at her with an expression she hadn't yet seen on him. Something raw, something that had clearly cost him a great deal to let show. "Samuel was owed something," he said slowly. "A debt our father left him, of a kind. I won't trouble you with all of it, but the short of it is, I made a promise a long time ago that whatever came easy to him, the ranch, the standing in town, a wife, if it came to that, I'd not stand in the way of it. Didn't matter what I wanted for myself. That was the arrangement." He looked down at the fence, at his hands, anywhere but her. "So when he asked me to write you, I told myself I was helping him keep something that was rightfully his. I didn't let myself think past that. Couldn't afford to. And now? Now he's gone. And the arrangement went with him, and I don't rightly know what that leaves either of us." He met her eyes then, steady despite everything. "Except that everything you liked well enough to cross the country for. That part was true. That part was mine, if you'll have it be." Susanna stood there with the wind pulling at her skirt and the fence half mended between them, and she thought of the year of letters folded soft in her trunk, and the man who had written every honest word of them standing not 3 feet away, waiting on an answer he seemed to believe he had no right to ask for. "I came a long way," she said carefully, "to marry a man I'd never met. I'm not in any hurry to make that same mistake twice, deciding on someone before I know the whole of him." Something in Thomas's face fell, just slightly, before she continued. "But I'd be willing to learn the whole of him, if he was willing to be known." For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Thomas Hawthorne looked like a man who had been given something he hadn't dared to hope for, and neither of them yet knew what it would cost the town of Miller's Bend to accept a bride who had crossed the country for one brother and stayed for another. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns often does, with talk. It began with the women at the Mercantile, who had known Samuel Hawthorne since he was a boy, and had already half composed a tidy, sorrowful story about his young widow-to-be, arriving too late to grieve a man she'd never met. That story left no room for Thomas, and when word got around that Susanna Whitfield was still at the Hawthorne Ranch 3 weeks on, and that she'd been seen walking the fence line with the younger brother more mornings than not, the tidy story curdled into something else. "They'll say what they like," Thomas told her, the first time she came back from town with her jaw set tight and her basket barely touched. "Always have. They're saying I came out here to bury one brother and marry the other before the ground settled. Are they wrong?" It wasn't unkind, the way he said it. There was even the ghost of something wry in it, but it caught her off guard all the same, because put so plainly, she didn't have a ready answer. She only knew that the letters she'd fallen for had never belonged to the man in the ground, and that the truth of a thing mattered more to her than how quickly the town could make its peace with it. Mrs. Hawthorne, for her part, said little on the matter of the whispering, though Susanna caught her once at the window watching a knot of women pass by on the road without stopping, and there was something fierce in the old woman's face that told Susanna exactly whose side she'd chosen, whatever came of it. It was Reverend Callahan who finally said the thing nobody else would say outright, cornering Thomas after Sunday service, with the particular bluntness of a man who considered plain speaking part of his calling. Folks are uneasy, Thomas. A woman promised to one brother, living under the same roof as the other, doesn't sit right with them, however innocent it may be. It is innocent. I believe you. Don't much matter what I believe. Thomas came home from that conversation quieter than usual, and it was 2 days before he told Susanna what had been said, and when he did, she watched something harden in him that hadn't been there before. I could send you back east, he said. Give you the fare, no hard feelings. Might be the easier road, for both of us. Is that what you want? No. The word came fast, faster than he seemed to expect from himself. But I won't have you made small for something you didn't choose. That's not a fair price to ask you to pay. Susanna considered him a long moment, this careful, quiet man who had spent a year writing her the truest words he owned under someone else's name, and who now seemed more troubled by what the town might say than by anything he actually wanted for himself. You've spent your whole life making yourself smaller so your brother could stand taller, she said. I didn't come 3,000 miles to watch you do it again, over me. Susanna, I'm not asking your permission to stay, Thomas. I'm telling you I'd like to. What you do about the talk in town is your own business to settle, but I'd thank you not to settle it by sending me away on my behalf. It was, she would think later, the first time she'd seen him truly surprised. He did not send her away. What he did instead, some days later, was walk into town himself, alone, and speak with Reverend Callahan plainly, and afterward with the mercantile women plainly, and by the time he came home, his jaw was set the way Susanna's had been the day the whispering started. Told them the truth of it, he said, all of it, the letters, the arrangement with Samuel, the whole business. Told them if they'd rather gossip than hear it plain, that was their affair. But I'd not have Susanna's name dragged through it on account of my silence. And Reverend Callahan says he'll marry us proper, whenever we're ready, and stand behind it if anyone's fool enough to question him on it. Susanna felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding since the depot. That simple? Wasn't simple, but it settled. He looked at her, steadier than she'd yet seen him. If you'll still have me. She thought of the year of letters, of the honest words she'd fallen for, before she'd ever known whose hand had truly written them, of the fence line, and the quiet mornings, and a man who had spent his whole life making room for someone else, and had finally, plainly, asked for something of his own. I told you already, she said, I would. They were married that autumn, in the small white church at the edge of Miller's Bend, with Mrs. Hawthorne crying openly in the front pew, and Reverend Callahan, true to his word, speaking the vows without a trace of hesitation in his voice. The talk in town quieted, as talk does when there's nothing left to feed it. And by the following spring, there was a new voice in the Hawthorne house, a daughter, dark-haired like her father, who would grow up knowing nothing of the strange, careful way her parents had come to find each other, only that they had. Susanna kept the letters still, tucked in the same trunk that had carried her west. She took them out sometimes on quiet evenings, reading over the careful, considering hand that had first caught her heart, without her knowing whose it truly was, and she would look up to find that same hand, now steady around a coffee cup across the table, or gentling a fussy infant to sleep, and she would think that she had, after all, gotten exactly the man she'd crossed the country for. It had simply taken her a while to recognize him.